Question 1. A fire has occurred at a workplace and a worker has been badly injured. A. Outline the process for investigating the accident. 10. B. Outline why the investigation report needs to be submitted to senior management. 5. C. In addition to senior managers, identify who may need to know the outcome of the investigation. 5. Part A was well answered by those candidates who understood the process for investigation of an accident and who set out an answer in a step-by-step manner. From ensuring that the scene of the accident is now safe, to the actions likely to follow. The consideration of the accident report by senior management. There are 10 marks available for Part A, which should indicate to a candidate that they need to outline a number of parts of a process to give an answer of sufficient breadth to gain good marks. Most candidates could give some valid points, for example, interview witnesses. Identify the immediate and root causes of the accident. Fewer candidates gave an appropriate outline of sufficient parts of the process to gain a good mark for Part A. The command word for Part A is outline, and those candidates who list it even valid points will have missed out on gaining marks because the command word was not followed. This comment about the need to outline is applicable to Part B, below. Part B had marks available for reasons that reflect senior managers' responsibilities, roles and authority. Marks were available for reasons such as senior management having the power to take remedial action and their ability to allocate resources. There were some candidates who did not outline sufficient, valid points for Part B. Part C was reasonably answered by most candidates, with many identifying that persons such as the health and safety officer, or other appropriate professionals and the victim may need to know the outcome of the investigation. Also, organizations such as the enforcement agency may need to know. As with Parts A and B, there was a common weakness related to the breadth of answers. Candidates would not gain the 5 marks available by identifying only 1 or 2 valid points. Question 2. Outline the key elements of a health and safety management system. 8. There were 2 ways that candidates could answer this question that would lead to gaining reasonable to good marks, depending upon what form of health and safety management system they had studied and were outlining in their answer. An outline that covered the key elements of policy, organizing for health and safety, planning and implementing, measuring performance and/or evaluation, audit and review, was appropriate. Unit IGC1. Management of International Safety and Health. 6. An answer would also be valid and gain marks if it outlined occupational health and safety policy, planning, implementation and operation, checking and management. Review. As the question has an outline command word, this indicated to candidates that they needed to provide more than just a list of headings. For example, marks were available for a reasonable outline of policy that included that it would need to be clear and set aims and objectives. Some candidates missed out on gaining marks because they provided too much content on only 1 or 2 elements. To gain good marks, candidates were required to give a reasonable outline of an appropriate breadth of key elements and not a detailed account of one, for example a very long detailed account of audit. There were no marks available for an answer that contained only an acronym or aid. Memoir. Question 2 is an example of a question where all of the marks available could be missed by not reading the question carefully and not understanding what is required. A few candidates provided an outline of the elements of a health and safety policy, and not of a management system. Question 3, A. Give the meaning of the term hazard. 2. Give the meaning of the term risk. 2. B. Identify means of hazard identification that may be used in their workplace. 4. This question was, generally, well answered. To part A, I, and 2, most candidates were able to gain some marks. A number of candidates were able to give both the meaning of both hazard and risk and gain their full 2 marks available for each. To part B, there was a lack of appropriate breadth of answer. There were 4 marks available for part B, which indicates that candidates need to identify more than just 1 or 2 means of hazard identification. Means such as inspection and audit were frequently seen in answers. Other appropriate means of hazard identification could have included health surveillance and consultation with the workforce. Although an answer to a question with identify as the command word does not need to be to the same depth as an outline, full marks for valid points cannot usually be gained by just a list of single words. Question 4. A. Outline the main health and safety responsibilities of an employer. 6. B. Identify actions that an enforcement agency could take if it finds that an employer is not meeting his/her responsibilities. 2. Part A was generally well answered with most candidates gaining some of the marks available. Marks were available for an outline of responsibilities such as the provision of a safe workplace, provision of personal protective equipment and provision of adequate welfare facilities. 7. There was a common weakness among candidates who did not outline sufficient valid points to gain the 6 marks available for this question. It is not clear whether this was due to poor examination technique or whether the 1 or 2 responsibilities outlined were the only ones the candidate knew. Part A required an outline, so a list of words such as training would not meet the requirement of the command word and marks would be missed. Part B was also generally well answered, with many candidates being able to identify actions such as the issuing of a notice to cease the work, or to close the site and their prosecution of the organization or individuals. Question 5. Identify precautions that could be taken to help ensure the health and safety of visitors to a workplace. 8. This question had marks available for precautions such as having suitable perimeter controls so as to manage access to a workplace, ensuring that visitors are identifiable by such means as a visitor badge and ensuring that visitors understand and abide by site rules. As with other questions on this IGC1 paper, a number of candidates missed out on gaining marks because they identified too few precautions to gain most or all of their 8 marks available. As commented earlier in this report, it is not clear whether this was due to a weakness in examination technique or whether the few precautions that were identified were all that a candidate knew. Although this question began with identify and requires an answer of a depth appropriate to that command word, some candidates missed marks by giving insufficient content to their points in their answer, for example just writing P.P.E. Question 6. A university has a security worker who works alone when all staff and students have left. Outline what needs to be considered in order to reduce the health and safety risks to this lone worker. 8. This question requires candidates to consider what health and safety risks might face this lone worker and what needs to be considered in order to reduce and control those risks. Most candidates were able to gain some marks by providing an outline of points such as the provision of an induction to the site to make the security worker aware of hazards, keeping in regular communication with the lone worker to check that all is well and security precautions to keep intruders out. There were 8 marks available for this question, which indicates to candidates that a reasonable breadth of points needs to be outlined in order to gain full marks, not just 1 or 2 points. This was another outline question, and again some candidates missed out on marks by providing only a list of points such as training, communication or P.P.E. 8. Some candidates went into far too much detail on 1 or 2 particular considerations, such as a very detailed account of how distant supervision might be arranged. There is a comment above, in the general comments section of this report, that candidates are likely to benefit from practicing questions in examination-like settings. Some of the variation in performance by candidates on this question may reflect that some had practiced and received feedback about the breadth and depth of answers, and others had not. Question 7. Outline potential barriers to achieving good standards of health and safety. 8. This question saw candidates produce a range of answers of very differing quality and with consequent differences in the number of marks that could be awarded. There were marks available for an outline of barriers that might be observed within an organization, such as a lack of consultation and/or communication with the workforce, lack of training and/or the right competencies, and ineffective internal health and safety policies and procedures. Marks were also available for an outline of broader potential barriers, such as the expectations of particular industries or of the country of operation. A number of candidates appeared to take a very narrow view of what the potential barriers may be, and only included internal barriers such as training issues in their answer. Question 8. A. Give the meaning of the term permit to work. 2. B. Identify 3 types of activity that may require a permit to work, and give the reasons why in each case. 6. To Part A. An acceptable meaning would have been one that included such points as: the permit is a formal documented procedure, that it protects work people engaged in high-risk activities or who are working in a high-risk environment, and the permit is signed to give authority for the work to take place. Some candidates did not appear to understand that a permit to work and a safe system of work are not one and the same. Part B of the question required candidates to identify 3 types of activity that may require a permit to work. These activities might have included hot work, entry into a confined space, and working at height. Most candidates were able to identify 1 or more types of activity. Performance on the other requirement of Part B of this question was weaker, with few candidates being able to give a reason why a permit may be needed for the types of work identified. The combination of a type of activity, hot work, and a valid reason being to control ignition sources and/or to prevent the hot work being the cause of a fire at the worksite was the most commonly offered by candidates. Some candidates, who may have confused permit to work and safe system of work, appeared to consider that all work at height, e.g. from a ladder, and work on any electrical appliance would require a permit to work. 9. Where candidates did not give a reason why a permit was needed, it was not clear whether this was because they did not know or because of poor examination technique. Question 9. A. Explain the difference between consulting and informing workers of health and safety issues. 2. B. Outline factors that may determine the effectiveness of a health and safety committee. 6. Part A requires candidates to understand what is meant by consulting and informing workers, and to then be able to provide a reasonable explanation of their difference between the 2 processes. Most candidates were able to gain at least 1 of the marks, with more confident candidates providing a good answer that earned them both marks. Part B had 6 marks available, which indicates to candidates that an outline of a number of factors was required. Some candidates gave 1 or 2 valid points, but not sufficient to gain most or all of the marks available. Factors that were common across the answers to this question included having balanced representation between management and workforce and a clear agenda. There were marks available for other factors such as the committee dealing with suitable topics and the status of the committee, access to the decision-making process, but these were less often included in candidates' answers. Question 10. Identify documentation that is likely to be inspected in a health and safety audit. 8. This question was not consistently answered well. The comments made earlier in this report, that candidates need to read and understand what is required of them, can be repeated here. This question required candidates to identify documentation likely to be inspected in an audit. All of the marks available related to documentation. Candidates who provided answers based on other aspects of audits, for example how an audit might be done, missed out on most or all of the marks. Documentation could have included communications with the workforce such as newsletters or the content of toolbox talks, health and safety policy, emergency, first aid procedures, etc. Many candidates who did read and understand the question gained good marks. This was an identify question with 8 marks available, which indicates that an appropriate breadth of answer is needed, not just 1 or 2 types of documentation. 10. Question 11. A. Outline why it is important for an organization to set health and safety targets. 2. B. Identify health and safety targets that an organization could set. 6. There was a common weakness in answers to this question related to the breadth of answers offered for both parts, either number of valid points in answers to both Part A and Part B. It is, of course, not clear whether this was the result of a lack of knowledge or poor examination technique. In Part A, most candidates provided an outline of one reason, with the demonstration of management commitment being the most frequent. Other valid points, such as the motivation of managers and the workforce by having something to aim for, were less frequently included. Answers to Part B often included valid targets such as a reduction in accidents or 0 accidents and reduced sickness absence. Other valid targets, such as benchmarked improvement, reduced insurance costs, improved inspection or audit scores, were offered less often in candidates' answers. As commented above for previous questions, many candidates missed out on marks because they provided too few points. The 6 marks available for Part B indicate that more than 1 or 2 valid points need to be identified.